Welcome back to Pat Psychology Masters. In today's episode, I'm going to take a dive into the fascinating world of neuroeconomics, the domain of inquiry where neuroscience and economics collide. Neuroeconomics research serves to deepen our understanding of the human brain and indeed how humans interact in markets. A particularly puzzling phenomenon in economics is the price bubble. The price bubble is when a market is pathologically overvalued, typically followed by a big crash in value. Now, we've observed numerous price bubbles in human history. Indeed, many of you watching will remember the housing bubble in Ireland, which preceded the global recession, when house prices peaked to astronomical highs in 2007, followed by an enormous bubble burst in 2008. We've seen the behaviour, but we don't properly understand it. Why do participants in a market buy and sell assets at prices so disconnected to their actual worth? What's the neural underpinning of this behaviour? Smith and colleagues ventured to answer this question in their 2014 paper titled Irrational Exuberance and Neural Crash Warning Signals During Endogenous Experimental Market Bubbles. Now, I know that title is quite the mouthful, but I promise you this paper has some really fascinating insight to demonstrate, and that's why I wanted to make today's episode based entirely around this paper. So, to interrogate the neural underpinnings of market bubbles and crashes, Smith and colleagues devised a clever experiment. They recruited 320 participants to buy and sell shares in an experimental market. This experimental market was carefully designed by the experimenters in such a way to make a price bubble inevitable. While the participants engaged in this experimental market, the brain activity of 44 of the participants was measured using fMRI. Now, before I get into the description of the task, it's worth emphasising how impressive this study is. Studying macroeconomic phenomena in a relatively small controlled environment is a daring task. Many researchers would have considered it impossible to recreate something like a boom and bust cycle in the microcosm of a neuroscience lab. And yet, that's exactly what Smith and colleagues pulled off. But more on this later. The experimental market involved participant traders starting with experimental currency, 100 experimental dollars, as well as 6 shares of a risky asset. The experimental currency accrued an interest rate of 5% each trading period, and the risky assets randomly accrued a dividend of either 40% or 100% during each trading period. Now, this dividend is the crucial feature that incentivized the market bubble. Participants could buy or sell risky assets to each other in exchange for experimental currency during each trading period. There were 50 trading periods in total, and at the end of the experiment, participants could redeem their risky asset for 14 experimental dollars. Importantly, participants knew this end value of the risky asset in advance. Now, the most important thing to remember is that the experiment endogenously created price bubbles and price crashes. The authors thought that maybe brain activity measured using fMRI could be a biomarker for the evolution of price bubbles in markets. Previous research had implicated behavioural factors such as euphoria, irrational exuberance, and mania in price bubbles. However, there was a lack of research providing neural data to support these psychological constructs. Based on the data collected once the experimental market had closed, the authors were able to split the participant cohort into 2 groups, high earners and low earners. The high earners sold their risky shares around the time that the price bubble was at its peak, whereas low earners either held onto their risky shares or sold them once the price bubble had burst. Using fMRI data, the authors found that Nucleus accumbens activity tracks the growth of the price bubble, and that low earning subjects buy as a function of measured Nucleus accumbens activity. In other words, the higher the Nucleus accumbens activity, the larger the price bubble, and the higher likelihood of low earners buying the risky asset. In contrast to Nucleus accumbens activity, anterior insular cortex activity precedes the impending price peak, and this anterior insular cortex activity was associated with selling in the high earners. Interestingly, the anterior insular cortex activity was absent in the low earners. In the high earners, the right anterior insular signal seemed to encode a risk detection or warning signal that is associated with selling profitably. Unfortunately for the low earners, they lacked this apparent risk detection signal. By realising the relationship between increasing nucleus accumbens activity, low market earners, and market bubble formation, the authors were able to link previous research implicating the nucleus accumbens in reward prediction, reinforcement, and subjective value to market behaviour. Similarly, by uncovering the relationship between insular cortex activity, high market earners, and impending market price peaks, Smith and co. were able to link previous research investigating insular cortex activity to market behaviour also. This previous research had implicated insular cortex activity to experiences of financial risk, errors in prediction, as well as unpleasant emotional states, such as pain, anxiety, and disgust. Nucleus accumbens activity in Smith and colleagues' study appears to provide an indicator for price bubbles that is consistent with historical accounts of euphoria and irrational exuberance near the peak in prices. The authors propose that the relationship between market buying and nucleus accumbens activity represents a new neurobehavioral metric for the financial cost of irrational exuberance. The authors suggest this relationship could be used as a biomarker for impending price bubbles. The presence of elevated insular cortex activity in high earners before the price peak, its concurrent absence in the low earners, its association with trading pattern changes, and the stronger neurobehavioral insular selling link among high earners all suggest that this increased insular activity may constitute an early warning signal for high earners to begin switching from the risky asset to the risk-free asset, experimental cash. Specific brain activity aside, one of the most fascinating results to come out of this study for me is that some participants were willing to pay up to 10 times more than the known value of the risky shares, purely based on the gamble that the price would continue to rise. So despite the share only being worth around $14, as represented by the end value of it once the market closed, participants paid up to $140 for it. Those poor low-earning participants. As you can probably tell, I love this study. I find the author's discovery of a potential biomarker for price bubble generation fascinating. Smith and colleagues really pulled off something special with their experimental design and pushed the boundaries of what we now deem possible in decision-making research. However, part of me wonders if the way in which the authors compensated participants was flawed. Participants were paid a flat rate for their participation, with their payment disconnected to their performance in the experimental market. I can't help but wonder, what would the authors have discovered if they adapted their participant compensation slightly? What if there were greater incentives for participants to be high earners? For instance, by connecting the experimental currency to real-world currency, if an experimental dollar was worth an end. Now, it's very possible that the authors wanted to design their study in such a way, but perhaps there were ethical considerations that they just couldn't surmount. What do you think? Do you think the study might have benefited from some tweaking to the methodology? Perhaps my idea wouldn't improve the ecological validity of the study. I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. For a deeper dive into the research, make sure to check out Smith and colleagues' 2014 paper. I'll provide the link to it in the description below. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Shout out to Professor Redmond O'Connell from Trinity College Dublin for providing some really helpful feedback on an early version of the episode. Be sure to follow Redmond's research on Twitter at Redmond O'Connell and on the o'connelllab.com website. Links to them in the description below also. Make sure to hit the thumbs up button if you liked this video. Thumbs down if you didn't. Please share the video with somebody who sprung to your mind as you were watching it. They'll really appreciate you thinking of them. And subscribe. It really helps me grow the channel and enables me to create free psychological and neuroscientific content for you to enjoy and I hope learn something from. Again, thanks a million for watching, and if you subscribe, I'll see you here next time.